Thank you so much. I am very happy to be here. And give me just 1 second here to share my screen. And hopefully you are seeing my slides and only my slides in presentation mode. So let's go ahead and dive in here. This is a repeat of what you just heard. So quick overview of the layout for the hour that we are together. We are going to do a real quick vocab refresh, a report review. I'm going to walk through some cases using the test specifically with patients, and then we will pass it over to Q&A. There is the Q&A section, so please, as we're going along, if there is a question, pop it in there. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. Terminology. I always have a terminology section in my presentations. I think that ensuring we are all using the correct words and that we know what they mean so that we're using them correctly, regardless of who our audience is incredibly important. It just helps us level set. In this particular arena, especially with food sensitivity testing, terminology tends to get a little bit loosey-goosey. And so I want to make sure that we are all speaking the same language. When we talk about allergies, they are IgEs, period. Allergies are IgE-mediated immune responses. They can be life-threatening. They tend to be pretty rapid onset. They happen in minutes to hours, typically speaking, after the person has come in contact with the substance. They can go from a relatively annoying but benign sniffly nose all the way through to anaphylaxis and something that's potentially life-threatening. That's an IgE and that's an allergy. An intolerance is actually a functional response to food. It isn't necessarily an immune response. And it typically isn't. It's a lack of an enzyme. It can be painful, right? When you think about lactose intolerance type thing, but it doesn't usually entail any life-threatening responses. And it tends to be immediate. It can be delayed, but it's usually within a couple of days. Whereas sensitivities are different. They are IgG mediated immune responses. They can sometimes be relatively quick from the symptomology that you experience, but they tend to be more delayed. And those delays can happen days to months. They do not tend to be life threatening. And so, again, really, those are sensitivities. They are actually a very specific thing. It's an IgG mediated immune response. In the interest of making sure we're all talking about the same thing, there are a couple of reminders that I always like to go through with practitioners when we're discussing sensitivity testing. For IgG testing, it's important to remember we are testing sensitivities. We are not expecting to see any response to something that we know people are allergic to or that we know they have a frank intolerance for. So if they have a lactose deficiency, that's not necessarily going to show up in an IgG test. It might if they're still consuming things with lactose, but it might not. IgG antibodies have a 21-day half-life. That means that it takes roughly 21 days for the number of IgG antibodies in the body to drop in half. And so we would expect to be able to pick up those IgG antibodies at any point in that time, at least, if not for longer. That being said, it takes roughly 4 days for IgG antibodies to be made, which means that if your patient consumed the food the day before they submitted their sample for an IgG test, we do not expect to see a reaction to that on the test because their body didn't have time to mount an immune response. The fundamental goal and what you're trying to achieve with food sensitivity testing is you're trying to get at what are the things that my patient is coming into contact with on a daily basis that are potentially causing these symptoms that they're experiencing that they're not able to correlate, right? They can't determine that when they eat almonds, they get itchy ears. They haven't been able to do that one-to-one. For us to be able to pick it up on an IgG test, that food must be consumed in adequate quantities on a regular basis at least 4 days prior to the test sample was sent in, and preferably for many weeks prior to that test sample being taken. And then obviously, because we are measuring an immune response, anything that impacts the immune system and potentially blunts that response could potentially impact our ability to pick up the actual test findings. So medications, things like NSAIDs, glucocorticoids, and that does include asthma inhalers. The thought that they're localized to the lungs is simply not true. If it's something that people use very rarely, like their rescue inhaler that gets used once a month or something, it's probably going to be less impactful. However, if they are someone who's on a maintenance inhaler, there is the possibility that would impair, just like a cortisone cream. Our skin is one of our best absorption organs. And so even though it's a topical, it can still impact our systemic immune response. Obviously, immunosuppressive medications, and then you run into things like anticonvulsants and some chemotherapy agents will have a negative impact on our ability to read that test finding. Let's do a really high level overview of the test. And this is an orientation. So the IgG Food MAP, it is either a dried blood spot or a serum. So it would require venipuncture. It's to 190 foods plus Candida albicans and Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It has the substances being tested. So the patient sample is being tested with the protein that most closely identifies to that specific food tested. And so that's coming into play when you see things that overlaps the pineapple and the bromelain. They're actually two different protein epitopes that are being tested. And Mosaic Diagnostics uses xMAP technology. It is an ELISA test. However, it is an updated form of an ELISA test. The benefits of xMAP technology is that it has increased sensitivity and specificity over the traditional ELISA methodology. The other benefit, which is really wonderful, is that it actually reduces plastic pollution. It uses half of the plate size that traditional ELISA methodology uses. So we're able to run more samples using less plastic and therefore less plastic thrown away from the lab. It also has the benefit of having faster read time. So the turnaround time on the test is reduced. So here's a sample report, and it's a dried blood spot. The dried blood spot test is by far the most common version of the test that we run. And as you can see, it's formatted in a way that is very user friendly and easy to interpret. The bar graphs go across as the reaction increases. It goes from green to this kind of green, yellow to red. The further across the bar graph is, the more magnified that reaction was. The foods that are tested are grouped by like categories, and this is really helpful when you're looking at a test. So in this example, me looking at this, I'm seeing, wow, this patient is really reactive to dairy. And for me, that's a big takeaway. And it's not necessarily as concerning, or I'm not going to focus on the fact that the beta lactoglobulin wasn't a huge reaction because that entire dairy category was lit up. And you can see as it goes through, we look at fruits, vegetables, grains. We do look at animal proteins as well as nuts and seeds, and some herbs and spices and some other kind of miscellaneous items like cane sugar, cocoa, coffee, which is so sad for people to react to that, and oolong tea and meat glue. In addition, we look at yeast, which specifically is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, as well as Candida albicans. On this particular test, because we are looking at IgGs, for the yeast and the Candida, we are looking at the immune response to yeast and Candida. This test is not diagnostic for the presence of yeast or candida. It is simply telling you that this person is mounting an IgG immune response to yeast, specifically Saccharomyces cerevisiae and Candida and or Candida. If you were wondering if they had yeast or Candida, that would be additional testing like a stool test or an oat. Towards the back of the report, the reactivity is summarized based on the high, moderate, and low findings. And most practitioners use this as a way to speak to their patient and talk to their patient about their test findings and create a treatment protocol for them because it's on a single little snapshot instead of going through all of the pages. Further back in the report, you will see that the reactivity details are summarized again, but this time there's values associated with it. The column that says not significant is the reference range for each of the individual foods. And the value, which is an MFI, which is going back to this is xMAP. And so we use beads. And so it's how many of those lit up for this patient. And you have an actual value there for the specific findings. So you can see it gives you a little bit more opportunity for depth as far as how their actual value compares to the reference range. I always point out meat glue. It's something that's unique to Mosaic Diagnostics Food Map. And it is something that I tend to see a fair amount of reactivity to. So meat glue, it's a transglutaminase. It literally glues proteins together. It is used in the food industry because it glues proteins together and because it tends to improve the mouthfeel and the texture. It is commonly found in your manufactured food products. So things like chicken nuggets. I don't know about anybody else with children, but chicken nuggets feature heavily in my child's diet no matter what I do. Things like imitation seafoods and sausage and all of those products that are lots of meats potentially all put together to form a single protein source. Those are your typical sources for meat glue. It has been linked in the literature to increased intestinal permeability, which we do not want. It has been linked to celiac reactivity, even in foods that are technically gluten free or that are even labeled as gluten free. And this is where we see, if you're familiar with celiac testing, most celiac tests are looking at that tissue transglutaminase. And so this is what they're picking up on. If the patient had reactivity to that, they would have reactivity to this transglutaminase substance. It's also been highly associated with increased bacterial contamination of the food. The FDA classifies it as GRAS, which is generally recognized as safe. However, EU banned it in 2010. So what am I going to do with the sensitivity information? The vast majority of people use an elimination diet. It's the standard of care. This is based off of those half-life of IgG. So if you remember, IgG half-life is 21 days. If you are doing a rotation diet where the food is rotated every 4 days, the body never has time to drop those IgGs. So you don't have time to heal and your immune system doesn't have time to calm down. However, if you're doing an elimination diet and usually you're removing those foods for roughly 3 to 6 months, now those foods are gone and your immune system has the opportunity to not just clear those IgGs for the specific food, but also calm down and have a little bit of a memory refresh about maybe I'm okay with this. As part of that protocol has to be focused on not just removal of the substance, but also intestinal permeability repair, improving healthy gut microbiome, rebalancing inflammation, all of that kind of stuff. Typically, there's a re-challenge of one food at a time, and you're having your patient observe for any reactions that are occurring when they're re-challenging that one food. I always get the question, how do you pick which one food to re-challenge first? And I tell my patients to challenge the food they miss the most because that's the one that they are most likely to fall off the wagon on and the one that they've had it in their brain that they miss. And it's going to feel like they're less deprived if they can rotate it back in. So that's how I pick. Everybody has their own way of handling this. If they do have a reaction in that re-challenge, you're re-pulling that food for another 3 months, waiting until any symptoms that came up clear, and then moving on to the next food that they want to challenge. Most practitioners do a combination of both, especially for patients who had a large degree of reactivity. And so that can look like complete elimination of the highly reactive foods or highly reactive food categories. And then those more low reactive foods being rotated in once a week, once every couple of weeks, etc. We'll go into this in more detail when we look at the cases. And so this particular approach to a treatment protocol is based on the concept of lowering the total antigenic load of the immune system. And I love this visual, and this is how I describe it to other practitioners and how I describe it to patients. The total antigenic load in your immune system, if you have a lot of IgGs, your immune system is filled to the tippy top, just like this cup, right? You're relying on those adhesion principles to make sure that this cup of water does not overflow. But the tiniest little drop of something, that very next insult, regardless of what it is, your immune system is already so full and so on high alert and so upregulated that the tiniest insult is going to make that whole cup of water overflow. So the goal of therapy is to dump the glass of water out, which then would allow your immune system to be more resilient. It can handle little drops here and there without melting this huge response. And you get ahead of that. One of the reasons that we find that it is this you're dumping this antigenic load is that IgG immune responses are highly associated with impaired GI permeability. And this is an analogy that I've used for years, and I use it always because every time I use it, I get the beauty of seeing someone's face or hearing someone's voice, that aha moment where this little light bulb goes off and now something clicked for them. So I'm going to keep using it. Our intestinal barrier, right? We've got these beautiful tight junctions, and it's like a brand new colander. And if you don't eat pasta, that's fine. In your brain, substitute zucchini noodles or something. And when you have this brand new, beautiful colander, it works just the way it's supposed to, right? You boil noodles, you dump them into the colander, and the only thing that comes out is the water. All of the noodles stay inside. When your GI barrier is working the way it's supposed to, you can eat foods and those food proteins all stay in the tube that goes through the middle of your body, otherwise known as your GI tract, right? It goes in through the mouth, then comes out through the anus. The only thing that goes through that GI barrier are the vitamins and the nutrients and the minerals that our immune system knows are supposed to be outside of the GI tract. However, when your colander is old and broken and doesn't work well, you take your pot of water and boiled noodles and you dump it into the colander, and you end up with a mess of noodles in your sink. This is what happens when your barrier integrity is compromised. Those tight junctions aren't tight anymore. And so now you have those food proteins passing through that GI barrier into places where they aren't supposed to be. And your immune system does exactly what it's supposed to do. It goes, intruder alert, this isn't good. So it mounts this immune response. And that's where we get these elevations in IgG food antibodies. There are a ton of tests that link to IgG testing for a myriad of reasons. IgEs, they are something that I always run the two together because I don't want to miss an IgE thinking that it's an IgG. And this allows me to determine if frank allergies are present. So then I can create a very robust protocol based off of not just IgG symptoms and IgG sensitivities, but also those frank IgE allergies. I always do celiac testing as well. I prefer serum celiac testing. And I have had many conversations with other practitioners saying by the time of patients in their 30s, 40s, 50s, et cetera, they know if they have celiac. I don't know that's true because I have had lots of instances where I've worked with a 60-year-old who had never been tested for celiac, and suddenly now she knows she's celiac. And she suffered her entire life. I've had that with 30-year-olds. I've had that with adults. So it's a silly thing to miss. Just do the test. Obviously, stool testing, it's giving you in-depth insight into gut microbiome, intestinal permeability, etc. You can run just an intestinal permeability test, but it doesn't give you the why behind the finding. And so it doesn't help you narrow your treatment protocol down. Other things are environmental toxins, and I'm going to talk about those and mycotox all in the same bucket because they present in similar ways. The symptoms of environmental toxins and mycotoxins overlap a ton with the symptoms of food sensitivity. So it is important to remember that the symptoms of food sensitivities can be somewhat vague and really widespread. It isn't just isolated to GI symptoms. And so are the symptoms of environmental toxicities and mycotoxins. So you want to make sure that you are not focusing so purely on one thing that you might miss that they have something else going on too. And then obviously organic acids or oat testing, because if they have permeability issues, they probably have nutritional deficiencies. And it also gives you another look into how healthy their gut microbiome is and some potential insight into overgrowth. But let's look at the first case here. This is a 27-year-old man. I'm going to try really hard not to call him a kid. He is a man. He came in with the most concerning thing for him was twofold. He had acne and he thought he should be done with it by now. And he was not recovering from a night out as easy as he had been before. He also did talk about the fact that he had heartburn, but he didn't care because he took Tom. And when I look at him, he had a little bit of a belly. He's a relatively fit guy. He's 6'3" and really quite muscular, but he still had a belly despite being pretty darn fit. He has history of frequent antibiotic use. He had a lot of ear infections and very poorly controlled asthma as a kid. And then as a teenager, he also had a big struggle with acne that a lot of antibiotics were used for. He lives downtown. He's living his absolute best life in his 20s. He lives downtown. He works downtown. He walks to work. And so he's walking several miles a day, sometimes at great speed, depending upon how late he was for work. And he does weightlifting in the evenings. He eats out for all of his meals, literally all of his meals. He grabs breakfast on the way to work, pops out with coworkers for lunch, and then meets his buddies for drinks and dinner in the evenings. When asking about specifically what he eats, he talks about, I try to make healthy choices. That entire conversation, though, centers around reducing carbohydrates and making sure he gets enough protein. He was not able to go into any more detail about his definition of healthy choices. His BMI is technically in the obese category, but with his weight distribution, that isn't particularly concerning for me. It was more the abdominal, so like the waist to hip ratio for him. This is his test result. The one thing that I said to him when I was reviewing this with him was, well, it looks like you're eating a variety of foods because we're seeing this diffuse reactivity, which can be indicative of a GI permeability issue, right? He is showing a pretty much across the board reactivity to dairy. There's some smatterings of medium to maybe a little bit higher than medium findings for some of his beans and his fruits. I definitely am zeroing in on that gliadin and the rye. On this page, his wheat and his gluten are off the charts, and his egg white is off the charts, but he's also pretty reactive to egg yolk and peanuts and almonds. And when we look at the rest of these, he has, again, this smattering of this diffuse low level with a couple of things that are really high. I'm glad that he's eating a diverse diet. If he was not eating a diverse diet, we wouldn't see this. However, I'm not surprised that he had so much reactivity. And I'm very much thinking because his profile looks like this, we have so much reactivity that the fundamental that I need to address with him is around permeability. He did have a yeast reaction, and he did definitely have a Candida reaction. I'm not super surprised given the amount of beer that he drinks. And so for this particular gentleman, the treatment protocol is remove the high reactivity foods. It is not realistic for me to have him remove everything. He reacted to a ton of individual foods. It's not realistic. He's not going to be compliant. If I tell him avoid all of these things, he's not going to be able to be compliant. And then I'm going to fail and he's going to fail. So in these protocols, I know some practitioners get frustrated because these protocols are very dynamic. You have to get the patient buy-in or they will not be compliant. If they are not compliant, your treatment failed, even if it was perfect. If they didn't do it, it didn't work. Get the buy-in on the highly reactive foods for at least 3 months and then do that one food at a time, re-challenge. For this particular individual, his re-challenge food is going to be more difficult because he said the first thing he expects to want to do is beer. Well, beer is going to challenge yeast and wheat and potentially rye, depending upon which one he wanted. That's not a single food. So we had a conversation about what's a single food that you could re-challenge instead of beer. Obviously, having him avoid beer completely and reduce alcohol intake in general. He is having a significant amount of alcohol every single night and more on the weekends. A GI repair protocol, I always use powdered GI repair because I want direct contact for those tissues with the substance that I'm using. And I tend to use a combination powdered repair, already pre-formulated supplement. For this particular individual, because he has this history of a very reactive immune system and a lot of antibiotics, I also want him to do powdered quercetin with buffered vitamin C. This is a beautiful and wonderful treatment. It is challenging though, because it doesn't taste very good at all. A scoop of this in a little bit of water, it is highly hydrophobic, so it does not combine with water. Those little wand milk frothers help a little bit, but fundamentally, put it in a glass of water, swirl it around, knock it back, and then take a chaser. Works beautifully though, because you get direct contact for those mucosal tissues of the quercetin and the buffered vitamin C. And I've seen it work wonders in patients with asthma, eosinophilic esophagitis, lots of food sensitivities, etc. We did talk specifics around diet and dietary adjustments. It was focused on the Dirty Dozen, colorful plate, and nutrient density, not just the macronutrients. He seemed to have a pretty good handle on that, but really those micronutrients. And the best way that I've found to explain that to patients that clicks for them is that bringing it back to that colorful plate. We did have a conversation about how challenging it is to control what you're eating when you're eating out all the time. And so I don't want to take away his social life because it's so very ingrained and he's loving his life. He's just frustrated by these couple of things. I don't want to blow up his life, but I want him to be healthier. And so having some little exchanges and some things that he can do at home that he has more control over and that are easy. So talking about doing smoothies at home and then drinking them all the way to work. So he's got breakfast where he knows he had his micros, his macros, he's avoided all of his sensitivities, and it's not eating out. And then taking healthy snacks from home so that he doesn't run downstairs to the coffee shop and grab a muffin in the middle of the day because he was hungry. He has heartburn, and there are a ton of options for working with heartburn that are very effective. Chewable DGL is one of my favorites. If your patient doesn't like licorice, it's a blocker to them using it. There are lots of other options. They can do a teaspoon of baking soda. Marshmallow cold infusion tea is very effective for people who will do it. This guy looked at me sideways. I still recommended it. He never did it. But there are lots of options for heartburn that don't involve things like Tums that could be potentially harmful. And then we talked about adjusting his workout schedule. He works out every day. He lifts weights every day. Rest days are so very important, not just for your muscles, but also when you are someone who works out heavily, which he does, it has an impact on your GI permeability. And there's been lots of studies on showing that workouts increase GI permeability, and that's something that we're trying to minimize. So having those rest days gives his body that chance to rest and recoup and gives the GI repair protocol a chance to do its job. And then prior to coming in for the follow-up IgE and comprehensive stool testing. So last case is a 32-year-old female. She is a full-time working mom. So she works from home and she has 3 kids. Her main issues were relatively recent onset brain fog. She has a little bit of dysmenorrhea. It wasn't awful. She has acne that she hadn't been experiencing prior to, and she had this rash at the base of her skull, right at the bottom of her hairline, that was really bothering her. And she's highly susceptible to URIs or upper respiratory infections. She eats on the go. What she was eating wasn't awful. She actually did a pretty darn good job. She had good nutrient density for the macros and the micros. She was all over the Dirty Dozen, not just for herself, but for her whole family. She had a good variety of foods per meal. The issue was that she did this meal prep. And so she'd prep meals and snacks for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And then she would just go through those. And what that ended up meaning is that she ate the same thing literally every day. And she would grab a hard boiled egg while she was running out the door to take her kids to school. And then she had these little snack packs of dried fruit and nuts and some veggies and like these whole grain crackery things that she would eat in the car while she was in the pickup line. And so her diet wasn't bad. It was actually really quite good. There just was very little variety from a day to day perspective. And over half of the times that she was eating, she was rushing somewhere. And so when we look at her test results, again, I'm seeing not quite like the other gentleman, but I'm still seeing this dairy across the board. She loved to grab cheese sticks. She was a big fan of yogurt. But the rest of this page, there really isn't anything beyond what I'm seeing in the dairy. When we look at the next page, I'm seeing eggs for her. That was egg white, not necessarily egg yolk, but she was a grab a hard boiled egg on the way to dropping her kids off at school person and would literally hard boil 2 dozen eggs every other week and plow through those, her and her family. So that was a little bit of a blow for her. This page, the mustard seed was slightly, but again, there's nothing showing up here. When we look to her reactivity summary, it really is about the egg and about the dairy. And then when I see this, she didn't have any yeast reactivity, but she was showing some reactivity to Candida albicans. And again, this is an IgG response to Candida. I don't know. This test doesn't tell me, does she have Candida? I just know that her immune system has mounted a response to it. So for this particular individual, we removed eggs and all dairy. So no eggs, no dairy for 3 months. And I had her avoid the common sources of Candida. The most common food sources for Candida are coffee, which was a blow. We also see it in most alcohols and a lot of fruits. And so for this, that was a little bit of a blow. We had to go through what are options for helping in the morning with that get up and go, coupled with she just really liked coffee. That was probably one of the most challenging things that we eliminated. And then we talked about how to add variety. She's a highly functioning mom who tries to do her best for herself and her kids. And one of the ways that she felt she did that the best was by doing this meal prep. And so we discussed creative ways to still do meal prep, but then add variety into when and how she pulled those meals out for herself so that she was not eating the exact same thing every day for 3 weeks. Digestive enzymes with meals to help her break everything down, going back to that GI repair. So focus on products, again, the powdered products that have aloe, glutamine, cyprium. She was very much into doing this marshmallow root cold infusion tea. If you've not heard about it, if you've not familiar with it, it's super simple and really very effective. You take a mason jar, put about a third of the mason jar of dried marshmallow root, and then you fill the rest of the jar with cold water, shake it up, put the lid on, shake it up, put it in the fridge, let it sit for 24 hours, and then strain it out. And then that liquid that you have, it's got a good viscosity to it. And you can add that to tea. You can drink it by itself with a little bit of warm water. It has a really earthy taste. Some people love it. Some people need a little bit of honey with it. But it is a wonderful demulcent to help heal mucosal surfaces. It's also quite effective for people who have heartburn. Obviously, probiotics. And then she didn't take any supplements. Everybody else in her family took supplements, but she didn't, which I hear that a lot from moms. So good, high quality multivitamin mineral. I put her in quercetin. She did really well with quercetin capsules. And so we didn't go to the powder that the other gentleman was on. And then good, high dose, high quality omega 3s. We talked about what happens when you eat on the go. Our bodies, there's this rest and digest, right? So we do best when we are eating in under parasympathetic mode. We do not do as well when we are eating in sympathetic mode, right? Sympathetic mode is your run from the tiger. Any body system that you do not need to run from the tiger is going to be down regulated. You don't need to digest your meal if you're running from a tiger. So your digestion gets down regulated. So we talked about, even though you think you're doing well and good by eating really healthy, if you are constantly eating on the go and you are constantly eating in a sympathetic state, you're not getting from your food what you think you're getting and what you should be getting, and it's still potentially problematic. We also discussed the art of letting go. I recommend to these patients, because this particular type of person is the bulk of people I work with. I always recommend this book called Essentialism. I can't remember who it's by, but it's beautiful. And it's that fundamental, the art of letting go, focus on what is actually truly important and don't put the small stuff and let those things go. That book for her, that conversation and really focusing on that was one of the biggest game changers in how she felt over those next several months. And then I want to stool test prior because I want to see what her gut microbiome looked like. I want to look at her calprotectin and pancreatic elastase and those types of things to make sure that the comprehensive protocol is the right one for her. So at this point, we're going to flip it over to questions. I see that there are quite a few. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that we can pop in and see what questions you guys had. So one of the first questions that we have is treatment suggestions, the dose, the duration, how do you track progress, how are you basing it on test interpretation, and then repeat testing. Those are excellent questions. I will start with the last part of that question, the repeat test part. So if a person has been avoiding their foods for 3 to 6 months, when you repeat the test, it should be negative because those IgG should have gone away. There's been enough time for the half-life to work through them, and we should be good. I do not tend to repeat IgG testing in patients for whom I have had good resolution of symptoms. I move on to other testing based off of the symptoms that are left. If they have been compliant with the treatment protocol, and even if they haven't been compliant, but if after 3 months of them telling me they eliminated foods, they followed the protocol, but they still have all the same symptoms, I am going to repeat an IgG test. I do it because I expect to see that they're not 100% avoiding their foods. I also want to see if perhaps their substitution of one food for another food has been problematic. But again, so I don't always retest the IgG test. I always want to make sure that I'm also not honing so far into food sensitivities that I may be missing something. So looking at the stool testing, looking at IgE testing, looking at oat testing and mycotoxins and those types of things to make sure that what I'm not solely putting all of the onus on a food sensitivity and missing the fact that they had high mycotoxins, for example. As far as protocols, hopefully the cases helped with that. It is very person specific. If I'm working with someone and they look like the gentleman that was the first case and they reacted to a ton of things across multiple categories, but they tell me that the only thing that they can eliminate are eggs, I'm going to push that a little bit to see if I can get them to eliminate more than eggs. But if they're really dug in on that, then we're going to eliminate eggs and we're going to hit the repair part of that protocol very hard. And we're going to do a ton of other testing and hope that it's going to give me ends for them to be more compliant with other things. It fundamentally, you have to meet your patient where they're at. Your beautiful and brilliant protocol is only as good as they're able to be compliant with. And I think that everybody on this call is probably very familiar with the R protocols, whether it's a 3 or a 4 or a 5 or a 7 or whatever R. And you go through those steps. It's a beautiful kind of checklist that has been laid out for us. And those things happen if you follow that and you recognize that it's not a do one, and then when you're done with that, do the next, and then when you're done with that, do the next. All of those things happen at the same time. It's this little circular thing. You're doing all of them. Usually you will have really good success. You may not get rid of all of their symptoms. You may have to dive into certain testings and certain aspects of their life a little bit deeper. But if you follow one of those protocols, you're going to hit most of their symptoms and they're going to be very happy with you. So let's hop into here. Would I consider another test like a stool test instead of IG? It just depends on the patient. The tests that I run together the most, all literally at the same time, are IgG, IgE, and a comprehensive stool. Because to me, that gives me enough information to get them going in a good, robust, but hopefully not overwhelming treatment protocol. And it also focuses on the GI, right? All else fails, keep it simple, start with the gut. If you don't start with the gut, doesn't matter what else you do. Obviously, this is going to be different if someone comes in and they're like, yeah, my house has mold. I'm going to start with mycotoxins, right? I'm going to start with something else. But for the vast majority of people who are coming in with these kind of diffuse symptoms, I tend to start with IgG, IgE, and comprehensive stool testing. Half-life of IgGs is roughly 21 days. Yeah. Mimicry. The mimicry question is, what if someone comes back positive for a substance, a food that they never consume? There absolutely can be mimicry, especially in foods that are very similar. So for Mosaic Diagnostics, and I can't speak to other companies' methodology. So for Mosaic, we look specifically at the protein most closely associated with that specific food. And I'm going to use vanilla as an example here because it's one that is fresh in my brain because it just came up for us. And so vanilla on our test, it is a vanilla protein isotope. It is not unique to natural vanilla or synthetic vanilla. You'll see it in both of those. You also see that protein in vanilla scented body lotion. You also see that as a flavor rounder. Vanilla is used in so many things in our foods and things that you would never even think about because you wouldn't like, why would you put vanilla in that? But it's there because it's a flavor enhancer and it rounds out and bolds the flavors. And so when someone tells me that they're having, I never eat that. The first thing that I encourage them to do is go through their pantry. So go through your pantry. Are you sure that it's not on anything you're eating? Literally read all your labels. Then go to all your personal care products. Read all your labels. Make sure that you know what all of the ingredients are. I love the Talk Dirty, I believe is what it's called, app, because you can program in all of the things you're avoiding. And then if you scan the barcode, it tells you if something you're avoiding is actually in that personal care product. And I have been surprised a lot. So it's possible for mimicry. In my experience, it's not probable. Most people find it in something that they didn't know it was in. Are there any ways we can deduce whether their IgG cycle is longer or shorter than the 21 days before we run the test? That's a great question. All the literature that I've seen on IgG half-life is 21 to sometimes they go up to 25 days. I don't know if that's going to make a huge difference in the test rates. They're going to break those things down. The biggest thing isn't necessarily how quickly they're breaking their IgGs down, because at least based on literature, it's not going to be faster than those 21 days. It's more about, do they have something that's going to suppress their body's ability to create those? And so are they on any immunosuppressants or anything like that? That would be where you would want to be concerned that you may not get accurate test results because they're just not making the IgGs. Their body doesn't have the ability to. Is meat glue transglutaminase actually found in the test? Yes, it's one of the biomarkers on the miscellaneous section. It's in there with coffee and green tea and those types of things. And we tend to see it positive, and it's positive in kids a fair amount because, again, chicken nuggets, especially if they're doing chicken nuggets that are like fast food chicken nuggets. And we see it in adults who have a lot of prepackaged foods in their diet. We don't see it a ton in adults who are eating a very healthy and a whole foods based diet because they just don't get exposed to it. Bulletproof coffee. I knew that was going to come up. So bulletproof coffee, as far as Candida and yeast, frankly, right? That's their thing, right? They say that they don't have any, that they test for it and it isn't there. I know that people who have mycotoxins, some people can consume bulletproof coffee and not have any issues with it, or other coffee. Bulletproof at this point is not the only brand of coffee that does the mycotoxin and the candida screening. So there are currently multiple brands out there that are options. So those brands of coffee that are screening for molds and yeasts, some people who have sensitivities are able to drink those and they have no problems. I have not seen that be consistent across the board, nor have I seen that be consistent across brands. So I think it's very individual specific. Someone with immunodeficiency constantly getting sick, would this test make sense for them? I don't know if I have patients with immunodeficiency or patients who are on immunosuppressive meds. This is not typically where I start for them. I tend to start with the comprehensive stool analysis. I start with an oat, and I start with, depending upon their history, like a mycotox profile. Their symptomology overlaps quite a bit, and they're not going to be as impacted by those medications or by the fact that their immune system has been blunted. I have found, even in patients who have a blunted immune response and or are on a large number of immunosuppressive meds, that IgE and IgG testing can actually be helpful, because you just have to be mindful of how you interpret the test, right? It's like any other test. You have to know what are their medications and what are they on coming into it. And so you could still run the test on them. And for me, looking at those test results, knowing someone was immunodeficient or on immunosuppressive medications, if I see a low finding, to me, that's going to carry a little bit more weight than it would on someone who wasn't on those meds or didn't have those conditions. Because despite having immunosuppression, this person still is mounting what is technically a significant IgG response. And so they can be of value. I don't necessarily start with them, but they are helpful. You just have to keep that in mind when you're interpreting those test results. And Mosaic has a great clinical team. So if you are running these tests on patients who are tricky, especially, schedule a consult with us. We'll happily walk through your patient case and walk through those test results and help work out the significance of the findings and all of that kind of stuff. Please do use us as a resource. So there was a question about fundamentally, if a person just eats a lot of those foods, like 4 days before they take the test, but they don't necessarily eat them on a regular basis, would we still see reactivity? We have a lower likelihood of seeing reactivity. And it's not what the test is about. This test is designed to catch the things that people are reacting to that are regularly in their diet. It's not about catching a reaction to a food that they eat once every couple of years. The likelihood is that they're going to actually catch that themselves. So this is really targeting those hard to pin down symptoms that are associated with what they're eating. I tend to have people keep a diet and symptom diary when they're in their 3-month elimination so that they have a good recall of, no, I didn't eat any of these things. These are how my symptoms progressed or didn't. And this is how I've been feeling. What I find, and I'm sure I'm not unique in this, is that patients tend to come in for a couple of specific symptoms. And then you work on those specific symptoms and they come back to you. And instead of being like, oh my gosh, that's amazing, I'm so much better, you get yeah, but no, there's this other symptom that I'm concerned about. And so helping them track how they're feeling, what they're eating, helps them be reminded of how they were feeling before, how they feel now. And it's fine if they have a new symptom that they want to talk about or another symptom that is now more pressing because we got rid of the first one, but we want to be able to track that. The test isn't designed and I don't know that it's a great use of the test or the patient's dollars to have them challenge a bunch of different foods like 5 days before they take the test. If they don't eat it on a regular basis, I don't really care if they mount an IgG. Like, that's not what it's about. It's about getting the foods that they're regularly eating out of their diet and helping them prepare from that. Just kind of scrolling through here. We've only got a couple of minutes. Yeah, how do I interpret if a patient has high or moderate reactivities but no intestinal permeability? So I'm assuming that you're doing a breath test and intestinal permeability coupled with the IgG response. I still do I still do GI repair because there has to be some level of permeability or the immune system wouldn't have had access to those proteins to mount an IgG response. So somewhere something is broken down. And it could simply be it didn't get picked up on the permeability or it didn't meet the threshold for reactivity and a positive finding on the permeability test. I always address permeability when I address IgG testing and IgG test result. Like those two things, I never separate them. So I know that we're at time. There was one last question about scheduling clinical consults with Mosaic. You have to have a practitioner account. So you just sign up for a practitioner account through the Mosaic Diagnostics website. And once you have that account, you go into your practitioner portal and you can schedule clinical consultations right there. But yes, we do clinical consultations with practitioners. So I think that's it.
Hi, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this class. If you're a practitioner, make sure you go sign up at rupahealth.com. And if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.